Back in 2022, I undertook the huge challenge of crafting my own world from the ground up. Since then, I've populated it with dozens of unique mechs and creatures and characters, each with their own lore and interconnected story. In 2025, I also wrote and published a novel set in this world, and today I'll be creating a diorama telling the backstory of one of its secondary characters. This is Gameyy Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. Ever since writing the Spinecrest scenes in my novel, The Children of Aegis, I knew that someday I'd have to feature one in a diorama. If you haven't yet read the book, this video won't spoil anything, but Spinecrests are wolf-like predators that roam the southernmost continent of Aegis, Fis'Alim, where most of the book takes place. I'm a little embarrassed to say that I actually had to go back and reread portions of my own book to recall exactly how I described these creatures. While I had a pretty clear mental image, many of these scenes were written back in 2023, and many of the details had changed during the revision process. Once I'd made notes about all the creatures' physical attributes, I got to work on the preliminary sketches, and boy, were they rough. I'm the first to admit that I'm a lousy creature artist, and I was probably a little ambitious to even attempt this. At this point, I experimented more with mixing the wolf's base design with other animals, like iguanas, sharks, and wild boars' heads. I liked the boar hybrid best of all, so using this red pencil, I mapped out the musculature, which would be very important as a reference for sculpting later on. But for now, I still needed to nail down the look of the Spinecrest, so I set out to sketch the entire creature in detail, from the kyphosis curvature of the spine to the neurotoxic quills running down its back. Once the pencil sketch was locked in, I outlined everything in these waterproof felt tip pens, using a 0.2 thickness for the finer details, like the quills and the fur, and a 0.4 for the bolder outlines. Next came the watercolors. I like to treat the concept art as a place for experimentation, especially when it comes to color, because even though many of the details had been explicitly stated in the novel, there was still a lot of room for interpretation. And I also realized that I'd have to make the creature a bit less white than I originally envisioned in order to make it stand out against the snow. Another realization at this point was that the placement of the eyes was making the creature too cartoonish looking, so I made a mental note to change this in the following stage. To sculpt the Spinecrest in Blender, I started with the head, using a sphere to gradually form the skull and upper jaw. One feature you'll see me using a lot during this project is proportional editing. Typically, when editing a mesh, you affect only the selected points, called vertices or the faces. But with proportional editing turned on, you can choose how much of the surrounding mesh is affected by these edits, allowing you to quickly create flowing, organic shapes. Once I had the general shape of the skull, I went into sculpt mode to rough out the gums and the curvature inside the roof of the mouth. I always start this process with a low polygon count, which is why everything looks so blocky right now. But with this multi-resolution modifier applied here, the faces were multiplied, giving me a lot more resolution as I went in for the finer details. One such detail was the expression. The grab tool helped a lot here, as it literally pushes and smears the mesh around. Using the layer tool, I then added in the gums, then refine the nose, snout, and the mouth. For the teeth, I use cones, and I reduced my work by using a mirror modifier to duplicate the objects on the opposite side of the jaw. As with the head, I turned on proportional editing, then rotated the tip for a smooth fang-like curve. I finally went back and sculpted some additional detail. And it's always a little funny going back and rewatching my footage as I work on the video, because I realized just how unnecessary these details ended up being. After setting in the eyes, I used the inflate tool to add the skin folds around them, which helped further intensify the Spinecrest's expression. Referencing wolf skulls helped me to get all the bone ridges and indentations just right, and to save myself a little time, I duplicated and flipped this mesh to create the lower jaw. The process was then repeated here, smoothing and indenting where needed, and eventually adding in all the teeth. You'll notice that this is where the Spinecrest's head really deviates from that of a wolf, as they're described in the book as having jaws capable of unlatching in order to bite larger prey. Once sculpting was finished, I joined the upper and lower jaws into one object, then remeshed it all so that it'd be a single mesh, allowing me to smooth out the seams. With the head done for now, I moved on to the body, using spheres with proportional editing once again, and this is where the musculature I'd mapped out earlier really paid off. Although all of this would eventually be covered in fur, I didn't just want vague, rounded surfaces. Instead, having this underlying musculature would result in a much more lifelike and believable form. Similarly, the tendons standing out in these leaping feet would really help to sell the dynamic pose of the Spinecrest. Once I was sure about this lunging pose, I joined all the limbs and the torso into one object and smoothed out the seams. I then got to work on the ears, which had a surprising effect on the overall appearance, making this thing look a lot faster and more dangerous than it had previously. The last and most quintessential detail was the giant quills on the back, which are filled with a strong neurotoxin that paralyzes their prey so that they can drag them back to their dens and allow their pups to finish the kill. Since these quills would be way too thin to print, I needed another method, but I modeled them here for a reason I'll explain in a moment. First though, it was time to sculpt in the fur, which is where it all really came together for me. I'd never used texture brushes before, and they took me a while to get used to, as there were so many settings and options to comb through. But when I figured it out, they saved me a ton of time and created a richly detailed end result. The final step was then to inflate the fur around the quills so that the interaction between these two surfaces would feel a little more natural. Finally, I used a Boolean modifier to cut the quill shapes into the model, essentially pre-drilling holes for spines that would be handcrafted and added later. The print came out beautiful, with the exception of this weird gap in the back. To fix this, I mixed up some epoxy putty, smeared it on, and sculpted in the details with silicone tools to match the fur texture. Then it was on to the actual quills, made from these very fine rolled strips of green stuff. A tiny bit of wire was rolled into their bases, and they were gently curved and left to dry. Although I was already a week into this project, the Spinecrest was only one part of the diorama. The other half was the hunter, Chelt. In the book, he's depicted as a shrewd but aging hunter, but I wanted to show him here in his prime. After collecting a bunch of inspiration for Chelt's outfit, I used a 1/6 scale doll to get the correct pose, then began sketching. Although the final outfit would end up being more contemporary looking, the original idea was something primitive, based on Inuit clothing. But one detail that did carry over was this fascinating mask design, which was handmade a century ago by early Antarctic explorers, a fact that made this just too cool to exclude. I also played around with incorporating goggles, based on carved Inuit eyewear used to prevent snow blindness, but in the end I stuck with the round version. To better understand how the jacket, backpack, and accessories would fit together, I had Chelt standing upright in the concept art, which allowed me to see everything clearly. About a dozen different sketches were done before finally settling on all the tiny details, at which point I moved over to watercolor paper. I will say that although I'm far from a professional artist and have lots to learn, especially when it comes to drawing bodies, I could really see my progress during this project. In this age of AI-generated content, it's easy to believe the narrative that these basic skills are losing relevance, but I think the opposite is true. The fact is that it feels like there's so much cheap AI content everywhere we look, so effort-intensive, human-created work is at a premium. And while I can't speak for anyone else, I find myself being more and more fatigued by any content, whether video, music, or text-related, that isn't human-made. If you're wondering if I've used AI at my projects, yes, I did experiment a little with it in 2024, specifically to create these tiny posters in 2 dioramas. And while it saved me a little time, I soon realized that the joy and satisfaction I derive from my projects comes from doing the work, not just from showing off a finished result. The other thing is, part of the work is coming up with a rationale behind every single artistic decision. That level of care and thoughtfulness is something you simply can't delegate to a machine. So, while I played around a little with these generative tools in the past, I don't use them at all anymore. Not for background elements, not for my videos or scripts, not even for thumbnails, and certainly not for story writing. That said, if you're like me and enjoy supporting art made by people, you're doing it by watching my videos. And if you feel like dropping a comment or a like, that helps even more. And if you enjoy the short stories I write and narrate on this channel, consider picking up a hand-signed copy of my novel from my website, gameybuilds.com, or grabbing the version sold and distributed by Amazon. With Chelt's design finalized, it was on to the sculpting phase, which would end up being much more complicated than the Spinecrest. But as they say, we don't do things because they're easy. We do them because we think they're easy. I had no idea going into this sculpt that it would end up taking me about 3 weeks to complete. The underlying figure wasn't anything too crazy, as I was able to block most of it out in a single sitting, using the exact same methods previously explained. Spheres for each body part, stretched and smushed with proportional editing. This was helped along by snapping some reference photos of the 1/6 doll from different angles and setting them on the X and Y axes for front and side references. However, things got a bit more tricky once I got to the hands. If you've ever tried drawing hands, you probably know them to be pretty tough to capture, as they are incredibly complex shapes that we're innately familiar with, making it very obvious if something is off. Sculpting them from scratch in Blender presented the same problem, but in 3 dimensions, and it took me a lot of time to get them to look right. Gloves done, I moved on to the arms, starting with the musculature. While this wouldn't be as visible as the Spinecrest's anatomy, I did want to get the general shapes in place. After the body was done, I made some boots, reusing the soles from the Len figure I did a couple of years ago. Once finished, I moved the boot into place, selected the uppermost faces, then used proportional editing to fit it to the position and angle of the ankle. I then combined the legs to the torso, smoothed out the seams, then used the mask selection tool to select only the faces from the hips down. This mesh was then duplicated for the pants and edited separately from here on out, with an orange color added so that I could see what I was doing, although in reality, all I could really see was Keanu Reeves in a muscle suit. Since these pants would be relatively thick and covering lots of insulating layers, I inflated the faces, and then came all the folds and bulges and wrinkles, for which I referenced a lot of different kinds of pants. But you might be noticing a problem here. These folds were beginning to resemble something you'd see in a soft material, like fleece or cotton, and not indicative of the stiffer synthetic material in snowwear, like nylon or polyester. You can see the difference in the way these two materials fold here. So, to get the correct look, I went back and sharpened all of the creases, making the folds straighter and more angular, and came away with something way more accurate. Next, to achieve the ribbed knee joint seen in the concept art here, I masked off the appropriate areas of the mesh, then inflated vertical lines into the material and creased the valleys between them. Pockets I'd made for a previous character were repurposed for Chelt's snow pants, and it was onto the torso. I think this is where I made the biggest mistake in sculpting the figure, as the finished model makes the torso look a bit too scrawny for the thick waist and thighs. But unfortunately, I didn't catch this error until it was too late. Since by this point I'd figured out how to get that stiff material texture in Blender, I repeated that process for the jacket. Now, this part might look really strange, but this was how I decided to add the raised collar, a cylinder with some deleted faces that I carefully repositioned one vertex at a time. Next, I used 2 solidify modifiers on the object, creating the look of a double-walled jacket collar. This mesh was then combined with the jacket so that it could be sculpted as one, and the first step of that process was to add more ribbing to the inner collar, both to match the design of the rest of the outfit and to add thickness to the print. I was getting pretty tired of working on the jacket at this point, so I switched over to the head, creating a very vague face-like mesh before carving in vertical lines for the woven hood. Goggles were quickly made from cylinders and spheres, and this is where things got really fun, because it was time to remake this Antarctic mask. I started with flattened spheres, repositioning points to get the overall shape right before moving on to the vertical strips, which I imagine were originally sewn into the hood to keep it from fraying. We'll say that's the same reason Chelt has gone with this design, especially since he's mentioned in the book as having had to repair and even sew some of his own clothes. I moved on to sculpting in all the details, creasing and inflating and deflating to replicate the original texture as best as possible. I then finished texturing the hood and returned to the jacket to add little details like these zippers. Next came the backpack straps, using the same process once again, starting with a simple shape, in this case a cube, dividing it up with a bunch of loop cuts, then using proportional editing to gradually move the vertices into place to fit snugly to Chelt's body. I then modeled the little devices shown in the concept art, like this transmitter box. I also created a bunch of clasps and buckles for the backpack straps and his climbing harness, though all of these pieces would have to be printed separately since they'd be very small and wouldn't be attached to the model with printed resin. Next came the backpack, using the same method as before. A simple mesh moved into place, then lots of detail sculpting. The very last thing to make here was Chelt's hunting needler, which shoots projectile needles laced with paralytics. Guns like these are used commonly on Fis'Alim, as the ammunition is lightweight, portable, and highly effective against most targets. Although, as with traditional projectile ammunition such as bullets, larger prey require more rounds to neutralize. And depending on the potency of the paralytics used, the toxic nature of the drugs can render the meat unsafe for human consumption. The trickiest bit of this part of the model was getting the position and measurements of the gun to perfectly fit the figure. I really didn't want the end result to just look like a cheap action figure where the accessory sort of just sat loosely in the figure's hands. Instead, to really sell the action of the diorama scene, I wanted to really feel Chelt gripping his weapon as if his life depended on it, which it does. Once it was finally done, I sliced the pieces apart, which would simplify the printing process. As I laid everything out in Chitubox, I was careful here to make sure that the supports were in places that wouldn't be highly visible, since they tend to leave tiny plastic bumps behind. After printing, I soaked the pieces in hot water for a few minutes, allowing me to carefully peel all the supports away, ending up with some wonderfully fine detail. Then came the finishing steps, starting with sanding everything down, gluing the legs and torso together, and filling any gaps with epoxy sculpt for a natural look. Next, for the needler, since the gun barrel needed to be so thin, I figured scratch building it was preferable to printing it, so I finished it here with styrene and wire from a paperclip. Everything was then taped down and set aside for painting, but before that could happen, there was one more important subject I had to build. In my novel, Chelt traverses the snowy terrain by way of a sled, pulled not by a pack of dogs, but by a large mechanical hexaped. This is not that walker, but their existence is intertwined, which we'll get into in the story. For now, though, I needed to build this thing, which started with a circular body, made from a lens cap and this plastic bit from a toy that I received years ago for a collaboration. After cutting a circle out of the styrene, I trimmed down the plastic and glued it to the styrene, then added this model hubcap for detail. A cheap toy became the underside of the walker once this gap was filled with yet more styrene. For the legs, I decided to use the arms from a Gundam kit, specifically the 1/44th scale Barbados Lupus Rex. I gotta say, it feels so weird to, actually build a model kit the way it was intended, using whatever this thing is called. On the one hand, it felt kind of like cheating since all the pieces fit perfectly and there was no problem solving involved. But on the other, the engineering behind these pieces is so impressive and intricate, and there are so many lessons to be learned here that it kind of makes me want to actually sit down and build a Gundam kit for real. Maybe after Beyond the Blight. Using this thin wire, a brass rod, and a drill, I also wound up some wire cabling, adding tubes to the walker's legs, and inserted, giving it just a bit more detail. Of course, I still needed a base to set everything on top of. To give the scene some dimension, I wanted a snowy slope on one corner, which meant I needed layers on top of the base, for which I'd use this wooden frame. After slicing that rectangle out of 1-inch foam, I used a wire cutting tool to create some height variance, then glued it down to the frame. After roughing up the top of the foam with a wire brush so that the top layers would adhere, I glued on 3 more layers of foam. To keep everything securely in place, I jammed in some toothpicks. Next, to smooth out the edges and cover up some of the gaps, I used this foam consistency modeling paste, which has become one of my most used materials for making terrain and bases. After smearing this onto the surface with my fingers, I let it dry, then sanded. But for dust reasons, not here in my workshop. Finally, since I wanted my little mechanical walker to be half buried in the snowdrifts, I trimmed a corner of it off. And with that, the 5-week sculpting and building stage was finally complete, and it was on to painting, and that means the short story. Please enjoy. Chelt studied the young woman before him. She shifted uncomfortably on the couch, as if trying to ward off his gaze, perhaps feeling a little like a bug under a microscope, or maybe a tusker caught in his crosshairs. A flagstock needle pistol hung from her hip, an unsubtle signal that she wasn't as vulnerable as she appeared, though Chelt felt that the prop was redundant. She had, after all, made the journey all the way from her station in Beltora to Killjar by herself, a dangerous trek this late in the season, when weather conditions could change without warning. Chelt tilted his crystal decanter a few degrees, pouring blood amber liquor into a glass. He picked up a small chisel, tugged open a circular hatch set into the wall, and stabbed his tool into the ice, chiseling away a fist-sized chunk of what looked like crystal. He shaved it down on a small cutting board beside the decanter before dropping it into his glass. Cool wisps of vapor creeped over the rum like a layer of fog. Chelt lifted the glass with a glance at the woman, but she shook her head, refusing the offer. The hunter shrugged, returned to his padded chair opposite the woman, and sipped. "So, Mrs. Otis, what can I help you with?" "It's about our quadwalker." Chelt made no response, though an image of the brown 4-legged machine flashed through his mind. It had originally been the property of Ina and Heedman Pelliter, the former residents of Beltora. After their death, Edmund and Freya Hodis had taken their place, and with it they'd inherited the Snowwalker. But while the Hodises were intelligent researchers, they were not the engineers that Heedman had been, and Chelt suspected that the station and its equipment was falling into disrepair. News of a malfunctioning walker didn't surprise him. "Solitude, right?" Chelt asked, feeling the sweet burn of rum descending into his depths. "Excuse me?" Freya asked. "The quad. Ina named it Solitude." Freya frowned, averting her gaze. "You knew that?" "I knew Heedman well. Never much cared for Ina. Always seemed unstable. She romanticized this place and its isolation. She was a liability." Chelt studied Freya, watching her reaction. He'd known the two women to be close. After Heedman's death, Freya and her husband Edmund had even moved in with their small children to serve as Ina's caretakers, though the old woman didn't last long in her deteriorating mental state. But to Chelt's surprise, Freya was nodding along, though she kept her eyes on the floor between them. "Solitude was the name of a song she liked. One of the lines goes, 'Solitude is the peaceful shadow hiding beneath the heavy stone of isolation.' Ina used to sing that all the time." Chelt didn't scoff outright, but when he next spoke, the sound was lurking in the dark thread that stitched his words together. "Anyone who comes to Fis'Alim looking for peace is dangerously naive." "Yes, I agree," Freya said, her voice flat. "Tell me about your quad, Freya. What's wrong with it?" "Edmund got it buried in a snowdrift. He was trying to excavate a marker when the bank collapsed on top of him. He jumped off in time but sprained his ankle in the process. Now he's laid up in bed with a swollen foot, and I'm here." Chelt lifted an eyebrow. "He's lucky he made it back to your station alive. And tougher than I thought," Chelt thought to himself. "A forecast has a white waller blowing in the day after tomorrow. If there's any hope of recovering the quad, we'll need to act quickly, before it's completely buried, Freya explained. Chelt rubbed the back of his neck. You brought charts? He asked. Freya reached into her satchel and unrolled the maps on a squat steel table between them. She slid a finger from a point indicating Chelt's station to the general area of the marker, which had been circled in red. That's no short hike, Chelt grunted. Why? With your hexaped and sled, it shouldn't take you more than a couple of hours. My walker's out of commission at the moment. I'm waiting on replacement parts to arrive in Bekana. So you've been traveling on foot? Freya asked. Not if I can avoid it. The season is late. I'm living off of reserves and hoping the parts arrive in time for next season. Freya chewed her lip. What parts do you need? Trochanter actuators for the rear legs, 2 of them. Size and type? Pneumatics, 15 centimeter. Made by Sanson 8? Freya asked. Chelt waved her away. Manufacture doesn't matter. If it fits, I can make it work. Freya nodded. Help us recover the quadwalker and you can take 2 of its actuators for your hex. But that'll leave you without a working walker. We'll purchase your parts off of you. When they come in, we'll install them and get our quad back in working order. And until then? We'll be fine. Edmund's hydroponics gardens are producing more than enough food. Vegetables, Chelt thought. In Fis'Alim, you needed a lot more for sustenance than squash and potatoes, but he kept his mouth shut. How do I know the actuators weren't damaged when your quad got buried? Edmund says the machine was buried but undamaged. You'll have to confirm that when you uncover the walker, but it seems worth the trip to me. You'll be getting those parts you ordered for free and without the wait. Used parts? Like new. We keep the walker indoors and I've learned my way around it. I'll bet you have, Chelt said, impressed. Freya nodded and stood, as if they'd come to a decision. I appreciate this, Chelt. If there's anything else we can do for you, you'll let us know. Well, hold on a minute. I haven't agreed to anything, Chelt objected. Besides, there'll be Spinecrests out there this time of year. You're asking a lot. Freya shrugged, setting her hands on her hips as she pivoted her body, taking in the interior decor. A collection of stuffed mounts hung from the walls above them, hunters' trophies. Horned, tusked, snarling creatures forever frozen in their most menacing moments. You don't have a Spinecrest mount, do you? She asked. I don't seek them out. I'm not sure I'd be the predator in that scenario. Freya turned to Chelt, smiling as she reached into the pocket of her parka and removed a metal needler chamber. Edmund's come up with a new coating solution. 1 prick from one of these needles and you'll stop the heart of anything weighing less than half a ton. Mother of Aegis, Chelt muttered. There's 50 needles in the chamber. I'm sure they'll help you add to your collection. I trust you'll get the quad out quickly. Yeah, sure, Chelt said, still staring at the cylindrical chamber on the table. Freya turned to leave, but before she climbed the stairs at the vestibule, she stopped and turned. And Chelt, be careful with those needles. I'd hate for you to find yourself on the wrong end of one. Thank you all so much for watching. For those of you asking about my second novel, the first draft is at about the 75% mark. You can get more updates on my Patreon page, and if you're looking to pick up some new t-shirts for the summer, check out GameyBuilds.com. I've even added a clearance section where I'm getting rid of older designs. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds, over and out.